Well, good morning, everybody. Are any of you getting the victory this weekend? Anybody got no clue what I'm talking about? Great to see you guys this weekend. We are kind of scrambling a little bit here. It's just been kind of a full court press for Compassion all month long, but we are happy in our hearts. And if you're new with us this weekend, I want you to know you're just hanging out with a bunch of very cool people, far from perfect, but good-hearted people with a big heart for the world. And so really great to have you here this weekend. Now, here's how we're going to proceed this morning in our Bible studies. We wrap up our Compassion series, okay? So first of all, we are going to review the whole series. Don't panic, okay, 10 minutes or so. Here's what I have found to be very ineffective, and I've been a Christ follower for 40 years, and I still have a lot of growing and learning to do. What is very effective is to be slaughtered with regular large volumes of spiritual and biblical information and living out none of it. In other words, it's almost like a drought. You ever had a piece of grass that's now turned brown, it's almost hard as concrete, and you turn a fire hose on it? That water's just going to ricochet off because it hits such a hard surface. Until the water settles there and begins to penetrate, it makes no difference in the life of the grass and drought, so right? And the same in our lives. It's very ineffective to just become an accumulator of weekend services or an accumulator of weekend teachings. What is very effective is consistent exposure over a period of time to one key piece of truth that, and rather than being like light, like right now the light coming down is light diffused, but if we turn this light into a laser, it penetrates deeply. Even light like that can cut, okay? So we want to deeply embed the core truth that Jesus is teaching us this month of April, and it's the biblical principle of living out what? Compassion. And that's what we're talking about. So that's why we're going to do the review. Those notes that you received when you came in are very important. So take hold of those in your hand if you would, please. Also, you can access them digitally online with YouVersion, okay? Then after we do a brief review of this series, I have a really cool guest and his daughter. So we're going to have one of the guys in this church and his 9-year-old daughter come out and talk to us for a few moments about how one act of compassion has honestly changed the world. After that, I'm going to give you a snapshot of statistics from Convoy of Hope yesterday, just so you have a sense of the vital signs, the entrustments we were giving, and sort of kind of the collective outcomes. We'll talk about that. And then the last thing we're going to do is we've got a homework project. We've got life application. Remember, you've got to move in your Bible study from so what. We'll spend the first few minutes here with so what. But then you go to now what. Because remember, truth that is not lived out, James said, the one that only hears truth but does not do the truth. What do we do to ourselves? We deceive ourselves. It's self-deception. So merely going to church for decades in no way, shape, or form guarantees any kind of spiritual progress or spiritual maturity or spiritual formation. In fact, if you're not careful, it can turn you into a Pharisee. Did you know that? Nobody knew the Bible better than the Pharisees. They knew it cold, backwards, forwards, top, bottom, upside down. They knew it, right? So simply knowing stuff, that's not the deal. Doing stuff is the game changer. And that's what God's been all over us about for the month of April from His Word, okay? So that's where we're going to wrap up. So take these notes in hand and let's do a real brief overview of where we've been in this month. We started off with it's all about people. We took kind of a comprehensive New Testament glimpse of Jesus. And why did the Son of Man come? To seek and to save what? People. Why did God put on skin and become fully man? To love and buy back people. It's always for God all about people. Now there's a disconnect because for a lot of times for believers, it's not all about people. It's essentially all about one person, ourselves. Jesus says, no, other people. I can't tell you how many times I recited that little mantra to our 4 children growing up. Child, the world getting their little fat brown cheeks in my hands, looking in their big green eyes. The world does not revolve around you. Get over yourself. The lesson for today, again, for the 8,217th time is other people, okay? I'm relentless. Apparently it took. I'm a humbled father. Okay, so in the thoughts of it's all about people, Jesus knew the Father's heart better than anyone else ever had. In fact, he came to show us the Father's heart. Because he said, if you've seen me, you are seeing God. I and the Father are one. I'm trying to show you what the Father's like. He's all about people. Secondly, we learned that Jesus understood eternal realities. Do you know what the hell of hell is? The hell of hell is an eternity outside the presence of a holy, loving God. Agreed? But a lot of people choose to live that way in this life, outside the presence of a loving, holy God. So hell, in some sense, is only a continuation of the life choices we made on this side of eternity. Ergo, a loving God does not send anybody to hell. We've chosen to go there. And God is not willing that any perish, by the way, because for God so loved the world, he gave his one and only Son. He's not willing that any perish. And so Jesus understood eternal realities, and he understood that only people make it from this reality called life to the next reality called eternity. Third thing we learned was this, that Jesus saw the vast potential in people. Notice, he was never put off by their current sinful realities. So if you're new to this church or just kind of kicking the tires, looking under the hood, saying, do I fit here? Do I not fit here? You know, could these people be my people? Is this how we roll together and so forth? I want you to know we're always going to be about people, and I add A-L-L, all people in spite of their current sinful realities in the moment. In other words, we're going to let God do what only God can do. He can do the saving, and he can do the sanctifying. You and I can do neither. What we can do is love people. You say, well, John, what if they're living this kind of a lifestyle or they're acting out this sin? We're going to love people. And if that bothers you, I just want to say to you, don't leave. You need to get over it at some point. Because Jesus always hung around people that everybody else rejected. So in that day, it was prostitutes and IRS guys, tax gatherers, right? And you know, we're still not super fond of IRS people. And so if you're an IRS people, I totally apologize. That was not nice. I paid my taxes this year, did my deed. Okay. So Jesus was called a friend of sinners, and God is guiding this church without pretense, without ostentatious, a bunch of religious fanfare, to simply be a friend of sinners and let him do the saving and let him do the sanctifying, and that we simply love and serve people, lift up Jesus, okay? So that's the first thing we learned. Then my wife came. Carrie taught us the second weekend on hope, and I was pretty bitter at her because she did something I never thought of. She gave you guys a crossword puzzle, and you were all engaged, you're all into it, and it's ticking me off because your heads are down, you're comparing notes, you're sticking your tongue out the side of your mouth there, and you're just, cheating from one another. Carrie talked about the fact that Jesus is the HOPE of the world, and I've put it there for you, helping others pursue eternity. Do you know that people don't care how much we know until they know how much we care? Till they see that we're authentic, that we're legit, that we're not a bunch of angry, judgmental, religious jerks. They're not going to open their hearts. And by the way, a convincing theological argument also won't convince them. Just love people. And when we pick up a towel and basin and we begin to serve and love people one at a time, it opens their heart like nothing else will, okay? He is the hope of the world. He said, when I be lifted up, I'll draw all people to me. The third thing we talked about was last weekend, and I hope that last weekend becomes kind of a default setting in your personal Bible reading, because we did Matthew 25. And that little, actually, the last point of the last sermon Jesus ever taught before he died and went to the cross. It's got to be pretty important, right? The last thing he said, and it was about sheep and goats. In case it's a little muddy in your memory, let me reread it very quickly, just so we clarify. And Jesus, God, is speaking. And when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his throne in heavenly glory, and all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he'll put the sheep on his right, he'll put the goats on his left. And then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat, and I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." And then the righteous will answer, "And Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" And then the king will reply, "I tell you the truth, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me." Say those 4 words with me, would you please? You did for me. So when we talked last weekend, we said that it all begins with the lens that we choose in terms of how we think about our fellow human beings. So is our a priori assumption, the foundational assumption that drives our behavior, when we think about other people, do we begin with the value of the person, like Jesus did, or do we begin with the unworthiness of the sinner? Now, sin is real, and it's awful enough that God became sin in our place and died in our place for our sins. It's that awful, and it is real. But Jesus, again, always began with the value of the person and not the unworthiness of the sinner. We said 4 things last weekend from this Matthew 25 passage. We said, first of all, that the only difference between people when they stand before the Father on that day is what they did and didn't do. Not what they said. God talk is cheap. What they did and didn't do. That's the line of demarcation here in Matthew chapter 25. Being a legit Christ follower is not what we say. In fact, who we really are has very little to do with what we say. If you want to know what we really are and what other people really are, not that we're judging anybody, is look at how we live. Our core convictions are lived out in behavior. We are what we do, not what we say. What we do, that is who we are. So if we say, "Man, I believe this is the most sacred, important thing to me in life," but you're living wildly incongruous with it over here, you can say that's what you believe, but that's not what you believe. This is what you believe, because that's what we are doing. Jesus took a lot of pains to drive that understanding deep into our hearts. Second thing we talked about last weekend is the kind of stuff that Jesus is talking about in Matthew 25 is the kind of stuff that anybody can do. It does definitely not require a high spiritual IQ. Just people like you and me doing ordinary stuff like feeding people, giving clean water to people, clothing naked people, visiting people in trouble in prison or sick and in the hospital or locked in their homes, whatever. That is stuff that anybody can do, because compassion, remember it, this is one of our main takeaways for the month of April. Compassion is a lifestyle. It's not an event. So Convoy of Hope is a really cool deal, right? But Convoy of Hope is an event that is a delivery vehicle for compassion. It's not compassion itself. It's just a tool for us to demonstrate compassion in our community in an organized way. So if you were engaged in Convoy yesterday and you're not going to do any compassion until April of 2018 when we do Convoy again, you're not getting it. Compassion is a lifestyle, not an occasional project. The other thing we said, third from last week, is that the Father's evaluation or judgment of our life will only be consistent with the life that we've already chosen. In other words, I alluded to that just a few moments ago, because in this Matthew 25 passage, and again, I'm not going to repeat it because we studied it in depth, and by the way, all of our teachings are online, and you can access them digitally on our updated website, and you can check it out there. He said to the righteous, "Come to me." He said to the unrighteous, "Depart from me." And before we jump to conclusions that God is harsh, what he's doing is only saying that which is consistent with the life that people have already chosen. Fourth thing we said, maybe the most important, and it's this: though God can be described in the language of doctrine, what God actually is, God is love. Now, he's also holy, he's also light, he's also a consuming fire, etc. But one of the dominant definitions in the Bible, and there are not many, of what God is God is love. So doctrine can, in some sense, describe in language what God is. But you know what doctrine usually does? It divides us as believers. And I'm not making a case that we become biblically or doctrinally light. I'm not making that case. I'm an education guy when it comes to spiritual matters. However, do you know how much angst between fine theological hair splitting has happened in the Christian church in the last 200 years? Let's just take water baptism. There was a movement that arose called the Anabaptists. Ana is the Latin prefix for the rebaptizers. And what the Anabaptists came along, which were, by the way, the forefathers of the modern Baptist denomination, they were saying, listen, really, the Bible doesn't teach infant baptism. What the Bible teaches is baptism following conversion, baptism following a decision for Christ. And so they were baptizing. Maybe a person was born, they were sprinkled or dipped, when they were 2 weeks or whatever, or 2 months. But then they came to Christ at the age of 14 or 16 or 21, whatever it was. That group of believers was baptizing them again by immersion, and that caused great schism in the church, and actually a lot of believers killed one another over that issue. Literally murdered each other in the name of God. Okay? It is tragic. It is one of the dark blots in Christian history. Okay? So wherever you may come from, no church background, Catholic background, listen, Catholics are our brothers and sisters. I have many Catholic friends, and by the way, some Catholic priests that are my buddies. Okay? So we're all together on the main things. So God can be described in the language of doctrine, but what God is God is love. So as believers, our life mission has got to be to live out what God is, which is to say, live out love. Does that make sense? If you grab nothing from this whole month, man, grab onto that sucker, seize it by the jugular, never let go, embed it in your life, and live it out. Let your life mission to be to live out what God is, for God is love. Now, there's so much more I can say, and aren't you proud of me that I won't? So we just reviewed what we've talked about for the last 3 weekends. And again, it's to deeply embed, not just strike a surface blow that goes away forgotten. I teach the doggone things, and I can hardly remember what I said last week or even in the morning. I'm not kidding you. And I've also studied it for 10, 12, 20 hours in addition to. So that's not how we grow. We grow by seizing a principle and focus on it till we are living it in our lives. Now, I mentioned earlier that the second part of our time together this morning in the Bible is going to be a father and daughter that are going to talk to us about how one act of compassion changed the world. You may or may not be aware that Convoy of Hope began with an extraordinary demonstration of one simple act of compassion. Would you please join me and give a warm welcome to Rick and Summer Fuller. Good morning.
Pastor, good morning.
Good morning.
Well, good morning, everyone. This story that Pastor has asked me to share with you, many of you are very familiar with this story. Matter of fact, many of you were there when these events unfolded. But for some, it'll be the first time that you've ever heard this story. And the year was 1969, right here in Concord, California. Harold and Betty Donaldson were on their way to a board meeting when they were tragically killed in a car accident on Highway 4. A drunk driver had crossed the center divide and plowed right into them head on. Harold was killed. It was tragic, and Betty was in the hospital for many months. Matter of fact, she would be pinned together. There were 4 Donaldson kids, 3 boys and a girl. And these kids, initially, it would seem like they would have been lost. But a family stepped up by the name of the Davis family and took them into their home. Their home was a trailer here in Concord, and there were already 2 kids, and so it was a house full, to say the least. And they've told a story about how on the wall of the trailer there was a schedule at times that each person could use the bathroom and each person could use the kitchen. It was that full. Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose." With this story that I've just told you, what good could come out of this story? It's tragic. But God had a plan. And the Donaldson family loved God and were called according to his purposes. In his book, The Compassion Revolution, Dave Donaldson writes that Bill Davis had said 4 words that would forever change his life as he walked up to the front of this trailer. Bill Davis had said, "You are with family." And Dave Donaldson would then say that it was at those moments that Convoy of Hope was birthed in his heart and in his family members. Many of the Donaldson kids, you would know. Matter of fact, many of the Donaldson kids would participate in my grandfather's Royal Rangers, my parents' youth groups. Betty had played the organ for many years right here at Calvary Temple Church, and probably performed in a number of your weddings. They were an integral part of our church family. And in 1994, Convoy of Hope began by delivering groceries out of the back of a pickup truck. And since that point, over 70 million people have been served. Over 466,000 volunteers have been mobilized. 113 countries have been involved, and $484 million in food and supplies delivered on behalf of Convoy of Hope. Currently, Convoy of Hope is responding worldwide to the earthquake in Ecuador, also the flooding in Houston. But on Saturday, they returned to their home here with Calvary Temple at Meadow Homes Park, and we celebrated an incredible Convoy of Hope event. One of my favorite scriptures is 1 Peter 3:15, and it says, "But in your heart set apart Christ as Lord, and always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. Do this with gentleness and respect." To be able to give an answer about where our hope comes from, we must first inspire a question by the way we live our lives. What good is an answer if there's no question? Yesterday at Meadow Homes Park, you inspired that question in the thoughts and minds of our community. A question when 14 churches joined together to serve our community and look like the body of Christ. A question that you inspired when hundreds of families were serving throughout the park in unity. You inspired a question with over 1,400 volunteers making people feel like family. And you inspired a question when tens of thousands of dollars were invested into our neighbors and our neighborhood. Living a life of compassion is not always easy, cheap, or convenient. It wasn't easy, cheap, and convenient for the Davis family. Mrs. Davis was here on Friday night. Many of you had an opportunity to connect with her. It also wasn't easy for what the Lord has done for you and what he's done for me. May we never look at those who need compassion as the hungry or the poor or the homeless, but may we learn from the Davis and respond and make them feel like they are with family. This week, after Pastor John's message on Matthew 25, the compassion message, I simply asked a question of each of my family members. It simply was, well, what now will you do? All of my kids had a great response. But later I noticed Summer, my 9-year-old, and she was writing something. And I asked her if she would share that with you today. Now this is Summer. She's my 9-year-old. She's known for the bunny ears. We like to say some people like mustaches, other likes beards, but she likes the bunny ears. So I'm going to have her read the letter that she had wrote.
Is it I who took care of the young ones? Is it I who gave the orphans food and water? Is it I who gave clothing to the widows? Why do we do these wonderful things? Because it is the best thing to do for others. And yes, it is I.
So whether you passed out hot dogs yesterday or shoes, or like the Davises, opened your home to a family that was in great need, God can use a single act of compassion to do remarkable things. Pastor.
Rick, Summer, thank you guys so much. Will you come back one more time?
One more time.
Okay, keep the bunny ears, girl. Thus concludes our series on compassion. Would you stand to your feet? Father, make us doers of compassion to our fellow human beings. In Jesus' name. And everyone said, I love you so much.